If you decide to render in Arnold, it makes sense to use Arnold-specific materials because those are designed for the renderer. Now, the basic Maya materials will work with Arnold, but let's take a look at how to use the AI standard material, which is the basic Arnold material. Now, we can change materials very easily in Maya by just selecting the objects and then just going into the attribute editor. Now, both of these objects here, the cylinder and the sphere, have a Lambert 2 material applied. But we can change that simply through this pull-down menu. So if I wanted to, I could change it to a blend or a Phong or really anything. But the one I'm really looking for is called AI Standard Surface. And when I change that, notice how that material changes. Now we can also do this by going into our rendering menu set, and under lighting shading we can do assign new material, and then we highlight Arnold, and again we have AI standard surface. So if I were to click that, that will apply it as well. Now probably the easiest way to view what a surface looks like is to render it interactively. Now we have a Arnold pull-down menu here, and if we want to, we can go into Arnold Render View. Now I want to make sure that my renderer is set to Arnold in Render Settings, and once we have that, we can just do a quick Run IPR in this window, and this will show you exactly what's going on in the scene. So this will render what we're seeing. So now that we have interactive rendering turned on, let's go ahead and take a look at what all of these attributes do in the AI standard surface. Now in this particular material, everything has a weight. So we have our base color, which has a weight. We have our specularity, which also has a weight. And then really all of these other tabs, so transmission, subsurface, all of these have weights. Now the weights are basically averages, so they add up to a maximum of 1. So if you have a lot of these dialed in, they will basically converge to 1. So right now I've got my base at 0.8, my specularity at 1, and those will work just fine, but just understand that it all averages out. So let's take a look at the base color. Now the first thing we can do is we can change the color of this. So if I click on this, I can say select a blue or something like that, and that will automatically change. Now this weight dials in how much of that color is seen. So if I bring this all the way to 0, you have no base color, but you still have specularity. So if I were to turn down specularity, you would get something that's kind of like a matte material. I'm going to turn up specularity, and let's go ahead and turn up the base weight to 1. Now, in addition to this, we also have roughness and metalness. Now, roughness is the roughness of the underlying surface. So when I turn that up, notice how the surface kind of just gets dark. Now, that's because we still have specularity on. So this roughness just determines the roughness of the underlying diffuse color. We also have metalness, and that could also be called reflectivity because basically it does dial in the reflectiveness of the surface. If I dial this all the way up, notice how this becomes highly reflective. It's reflecting this ground plane as well as the lights in the room and so on. If I dial it down, you get something that's a little bit more shiny, a little bit more reflective, a little less metal. And when it's at 0, there is no reflection. Now moving down, we have specularity. And if we turn that all the way down, the object becomes kind of matte, almost like a Lambert type of material, and we can dial in that specularity. Now, the color of the specularity is determined here. We can certainly change the color of that. I'm going to leave it at white. Now, roughness is a real interesting one. At 0.1, which is the default value, it has very sharp highlights. As we move up, those highlights start to blur. So at 0.4, we get kind of blurry highlights. If we go all the way up to 1, we get basically no highlights and we get a diffuse value. Now if I bring this down to 0.1 again, we get sharp values. Now watch what happens when you go below 0.1. They start to disappear. So they become more and more pin-like become smaller and smaller, and then when you get to 0, again, they disappear. So you can disappear them on basically both sides. So at 0, it's almost the same effect as 1, but for different reasons, because at 0, they've shrunk down to nothing, and at 1, they've expanded to infinity. So essentially, 0 and 1 are almost exactly the same. So typically, if you want really sharp highlights, you want to keep it somewhere around zero point 0.1 or zero point 0.2. Now, we also have index of refraction, and that's really kicks in when you start doing opacity and that sort of thing. And that's really how light bends as it moves through an object. And then finally, we also have anisotropy and rotation. Now, when we dial up anisotropy, the highlights will start to get narrower. And so this kind of simulates a non-spherical highlight. So for things such as brushed metal or something like that, where the highlight's not exactly the same depending upon the grain of the surface. Now we can also rotate this. Now notice how the rotation here doesn't go from 0 to 360, it goes from 0 to 1. So you need to go ahead and multiply this number by 360. So if you want it to be at 90 degrees, you multiply by 0.25, and that will give you a vertical anisotropy. If you go through the middle here to about 0.5, it'll have rotated 180 and so on. So just remember that this is not a 0 to 360 slider, so you need to make sure that you account for that. Now we also have a number of other rollouts here, and I'm not going to get into these, but I'm just going to describe what they are. Transmission is how light transmits through the surface. This is great for things such as refractions and that sort of thing. Subsurface scattering allows you to simulate the scattering of light beneath the surface, so it's great for things such as human skin, wax, marble, those sorts of surfaces. We also have coat, which allows you to do a top coat for things such as car paint. And then we also have emission. Now this one's pretty cool because it allows the surface to become a light source. So as I dial this up, notice how these objects become light sources, and notice the effect of the light on the underlying ground plane. So when this is turned up, these are actually become light sources, and they emit light into the scene. I'm going to go ahead and bring that back down to 0. Now, this is a lot of stuff to worry about, but one of the nice things about Arnold is that it does come with a lot of presets. So if we go up to the very top and click on presets, you'll see we have a whole bunch of these. So let's say we wanted to change this to car paint. All we have to do is go to that value and then just replace. Now we can replace the whole material or just blend it at a certain ratio. So I usually just do replace. And when we do, it changes it to car paint. We can also do things such as rubber, or we can do things such as frosted glass. So each one of these allows you a really good starting point for creating your own materials. So go ahead and play with the presets, understand what they do, and then go ahead and tweak the attributes of those shaders to understand how they're constructed.